The heavy wooden doors of the palace are shut against the afternoon sun, sealing in the silence that always follows a catastrophe. A stillness so profound, it feels as though the air itself is holding its breath in anticipation of the storm that must surely come. The stone floor is scrubbed clean, the servants moving with the hurried, terrified efficiency of those who know that history has just fractured. Yet the faint metallic scent of iron still lingers in the cool shadows of the hall, a stubborn ghost that no amount of water can wash away. It is the scent of a mistake that will burn cities. Outside, the Adriatic Sea laps against the jagged coastline with a rhythmic, indifferent calm, its turquoise waters hiding the secrets of 1,000 shipwrecks. But inside this fortress, the world has irrevocably changed, shifting from an era of uneasy tolerance to one of total war in the span of a single heartbeat. Close your eyes now, and let the darkness of the room wrap around you like a velvet cloak, shutting out the modern world and its relentless noise. Breathe in the salty, humid air of the ancient Mediterranean, thick with the smell of drying fish, pine resin, and the ozone tang of a thunderstorm gathering on the horizon. Feel the rough texture of the limestone beneath your feet, warmed by the sun, but cooling now as the evening approaches, and listen to the distant cry of seagulls wheeling over the harbor, their calls sounding like mocking laughter. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We drift back now, moving against the current of time to the year 230 BC, to a world where the map is not yet drawn in Roman red, but is instead a patchwork of tribes, kingdoms, and precarious alliances. We find ourselves on the eastern coast of the Adriatic, in the rugged, mountainous lands of Illyria, a place the Romans consider the edge of the civilized world, a frontier of wild men and dangerous waters. Here the RDA tribe has risen to power, forging a confederacy that dominates the seas, their influence stretching like a net across the trade routes that feed the hungry markets of Greece and Italy. For the Illyrians, the sea is not merely a highway. It is a field to be harvested, a birthright given to them by the geography of their home, where the soil is thin and rocky, yielding little to the plow, but the ocean is deep and generous to those brave enough to seize its bounty. To the Romans, observing from across the water with growing irritation, this harvesting looks like piracy, a chaotic disruption of order that threatens the flow of grain and gold. But to the Illyrians, raiding is a noble profession, a legitimate trade woven into the very fabric of their society, a method of survival and status that has sustained their ancestors for centuries. It is this fundamental clash of worldviews, one valuing rigid state control and legal order, the other prizing individual bravery and the opportunistic seizure of wealth, that sets the stage for the tragedy unfolding in the court of Queen Tuta. She is a ruler of rare cunning and resolve, acting as regent for her young stepson, Pinnes, following the sudden death of her husband, King Agron. Agron had built this empire, turning the Adier into a military machine, but he had died as he lived, amidst excess, succumbing to a pleurisy induced by a massive drinking bout, following a celebrated victory over the Aetolians. Now, Tuta holds the reins of a volatile kingdom, her power dependent on her ability to satisfy the chieftains who demand wealth and glory. She sits on her throne, draped in the heavy woolens and intricate silver jewelry of her people, her expression unreadable as she watches the approach of the men who have come to challenge her sovereignty. They are Romans, the ambassadors sent by a senate that has finally lost its patience with the gnats buzzing around its merchant fleets. Leading them is Lucius Coranius, a man of high birth and higher opinion of himself, accompanied by his younger brother. They walk into the Illyrian court, not as guests, but as inspectors, their white togas standing out starkly against the earthy, vibrant colors of the Illyrian warriors who line the hall. The Romans carry with them the weight of a rising superpower, an arrogance born of their recent victories over Carthage, a belief that the world exists to be ordered by their laws. They do not understand that they are walking into a lion's den, nor do they comprehend that the woman sitting before them is not a barbarian chieftain to be cowed, but a queen playing a deadly game of political survival. Coranius steps forward, his voice echoing off the stone walls, lacking the melodic cadence of diplomatic courtesy. He does not ask, he demands. He recites a litany of complaints. Roman merchants harassed, ships seized, citizens enslaved. He speaks of the Pax Romana as if it were a divine mandate that Teuta has sinfully violated. The queen listens, her fingers idly tracing the arm of her throne, her eyes narrowing slightly. When she finally speaks, her voice is calm, carrying the lilting accent of the coast. She explains, with a patience that borders on condescension, that while she is willing to ensure that the Illyrian Royal Navy respects Roman property, she cannot and will not interfere with the private enterprises of her subjects. It is not the custom of kings, she tells him softly, to prevent their subjects from winning booty. It is a statement of fact, a reflection of Illyrian law where piracy is a private right, not a state crime. But to Coranius, this is an absurdity, a direct insult to the dignity of Rome. The younger ambassador, unable to contain his disdain, steps forward, his face flushing with anger. He sneers at the queen, his voice rising in a shout that shatters the decorum of the court. He tells her that if the Illyrians cannot police themselves, Rome will come and teach them the laws of civilized nations. He mocks her gender, her rule, and her people's customs, threatening to improve the relations between the sovereign and her subjects by force. The silence that follows is absolute. Every Illyrian hand in the room drifts toward a sword hilt. Teuta does not shout back. She does not rage. She simply smiles, a cold, thin expression that does not reach her eyes. She dismisses them with a wave of her hand, turning her attention back to her council, as if the Romans were no more than troublesome flies. The ambassadors turn on their heels, their togas swirling, marching out with the stiff-legged indignation of men who believe they have delivered a reprimand to a naughty child. They board their ship, believing the matter settled, believing that the threat of Roman steel is enough to terrify a widow queen. But they have misjudged the depth of Illyrian pride. As their ship prepares to depart, a small boat approaches. There is no fanfare, no declaration of war, just the swift, brutal efficiency of a decision made in the shadows. An assassin acting on the silent wish of the queen, or perhaps merely interpreting her cold smile as a command, boards the Roman vessel. The struggle is brief. Lucius Coranius, the voice of the Senate, the representative of the greatest power in the Mediterranean, is cut down before he can even draw a weapon. He falls onto the deck, his blood mingling with the salt spray. the first Roman envoy to be murdered in living memory. The assassin vanishes as quickly as he appeared, leaving the younger Cornelius to cradle his brother's body as the Illyrian coast recedes into the distance. Back in the palace, the sun begins to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor where the diplomats had stood. Tuta must know, deep in her heart, that this blood cannot be washed away. She has not just killed a man, she has slapped the face of a giant. Rome, which prides itself on the sacred inviolability of its ambassadors, will not respond with another letter. They will not send another diplomat. They will send legions. The gnats have bitten the lion, and the lion has woken up. The war that begins with this single stroke of a blade will drag on for decades, reshaping the Adriatic, destroying kingdoms, and forging legends. But in this moment, in the quiet twilight of the palace, there is only the sound of the waves and the heavy, suffocating weight of a fate that has been sealed. The die is cast, not by a general crossing a river, but by a queen defending the chaotic liberty of her people against the encroaching order of an empire that tolerates no rivals. The peace of the Adriatic is dead, lying on the deck of a ship sailing west, and the storm is coming. To understand why Queen Tuta could sit so calmly on her throne while threatened by the might of Rome, one must look away from the palace and out towards the horizon where the water meets the stone, for the true power of the Illyrians was not kept in a treasury or a garrison, but was carved into the very earth itself by the violent hands of the gods. The Roman legions were masters of the open field, engineering flat roads to march their iron squares across the world. But the Illyrian coast was a world that defied straight lines, a jagged, chaotic fracture in the map that served as the ultimate fortress. Stretching along what is now the glittering coast of Dalmatia, the geography here is a labyrinth of limestone and salt, a fractured mosaic of over 1,000 islands scattered like broken teeth across the mouth of the Adriatic. From the deck of a passing merchant ship, this coastline looks less like a country and more like a trap, a dizzying confusion of deep, winding fjords and hidden coves where the mountains seem to plunge directly into the sea, leaving no room for the gentle beaches or rolling plains that define the Italian peninsula. The air here is different, cooler and sharper, carrying the scent of pine forests that cling precariously to the cliffs, their roots digging into the rock like desperate fingers. For an outsider, navigating these waters is a nightmare of hidden shoals and sudden squalls, where the wind howls through the narrow channels with a voice that sounds like a warning. But for the Illyrians, this treacherous maze was a playground, a sanctuary where every hidden inlet was a potential ambush point and every rocky outcrop a watchtower, because the rocky soil of their homeland was stingy, refusing to yield the bountiful harvests of grain that fed the empires of the south. The Illyrians turned their eyes to the water, deciding that if the land would not feed them, they would harvest the sea. This was not merely a criminal enterprise. It was a cultural adaptation, a necessity for survival that evolved into a way of life, turning the entire population into an amphibious society where a boy learned to row before he learned to march. Under the leadership of King Agron, Tuta's late husband, this necessity had been industrialized, transformed from scattered tribal raiding into a terrifying confederacy that operated with the discipline of a state and the ruthlessness of a crime syndicate. Agron had forged a mafia-style protection racket across the Ionian Sea, a system where safety was a commodity to be bought and sold. Cities that paid tribute were left untouched, their ships allowed to glide through the wolf-infested waters under the invisible shield of the Illyrian king's favor, while those who refused found their trade routes severed and their coastal villages burning in the night. It was a projection of power that relied entirely on speed and fear, and the instrument of this power was a ship that would become legendary in the annals of naval warfare, the Lembus. While the Romans and Greeks built massive quinqueremes, floating fortresses of heavy timber stacked with banks of oars and designed to smash into enemies with the brute force of a battering ram, the Illyrian shipwrights built for agility. The Lembus was the switchblade of the ancient world, a masterpiece of minimalist engineering. It was small, undecked, and exceptionally fast, powered by 50 rowers who sat low to the water, feeling the spray on their faces as they pulled in perfect unison. These ships did not rely on heavy bronze rams to sink their opponents. Instead, they relied on a terrifying mobility that allowed them to dance around the lumbering Roman giants. The wood used for their hulls was harvested from the high slopes of the Dinaric Alps, seasoned and shaped to slice through the waves with barely a ripple, making them nearly invisible until they were too close to evade. An Illyrian attack was not a battle. It was a swarm, operating in wolf packs. These light vessels would emerge from the shadow of an island or the mist of a fjord, closing the distance with frightening speed before the enemy crew could even rally to their stations. They would not crash into the Roman ships, but would glide alongside them, lashing the vessels together in a deadly embrace. Before the Roman marines could form their famous defensive lines, the Lembus would disgorge its cargo, 50 fierce, lightly armored warriors who fought with the desperate ferocity of men who knew the sea was their only retreat. They would flood the decks of the merchant ships, overwhelming the defenders in a chaotic melee of boarding axes and short swords, stripping the vessel of its cargo and crew before vanishing back into the labyrinth of islands as quickly as they had appeared. This democratization of naval violence meant that the Illyrians did not need a massive treasury to threaten an empire. Anyone with a fast boat and 50 hungry neighbors could become a king of the waves. It was a form of asymmetric warfare that baffled the rigid Roman mind, which viewed war as a collision of states, not 1,000 stinging cuts delivered by ghosts in small boats. This was the machine that Teuta inherited, a naval supremacy built not on the size of the fleet, but on the uncatchable nature of the ships and the impenetrable geography of the bases. Historians still argue whether the Illyrians truly understood the scale of the enemy they had provoked, or if their confidence was simply the natural byproduct of living in a fortress built by the gods. To the Illyrians, the Adriatic was their backyard, a private lake where they knew every current, every wind shift, and every hiding place. They looked at the heavy, slow-moving Roman transports and saw only prey, oblivious to the fact that the predator they had awakened was capable of draining the ocean dry just to catch them. As the sun dips lower, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of violent orange and deep purple, the Illyrian lookouts stand atop the high promontories, scanning the horizon, not with fear, but with the eager anticipation of hunters. They can smell the coming war on the breeze, a shift in the atmosphere that promises glory and gold. Down in the hidden coves, the shipwrights are busy, their hammers tapping out a rhythm that echoes off the canyon walls, repairing hulls and sharpening oars. The Lembus fleets are being readied, their shallow drafts bobbing gently on the tide, waiting for the command to slip their moorings and turn the sea red. Tutor's confidence was not madness. It was a calculation based on the belief that Rome could not fight what it could not catch. But as the stars begin to wheel overhead, reflecting in the dark, still waters of the fjords, a heavy silence settles over the pirate ports. It is the silence of a world on the brink, a pause before the collision of two eras. The sea, which has always been their mother and their protector, is about to become their battlefield, and the gnats are about to find out what happens when the lion decides to stop swatting and starts hunting. The water laps against the hull of a docked lembus, a gentle, rhythmic sound that mimics a heartbeat, steady and strong, unaware that the pulse of history is about to quicken into a frantic, deadly drumbeat. The answer to the assassin's blade arrives not in a sealed scroll, but in the thunderous displacement of water, a sound so deep and resonant it seems to vibrate through the very bedrock of the Illyrian coast. It is the year 229 BC, and the Roman Senate, a body of men who view vengeance as a form of architectural engineering, has authorized a response that is terrifying in its sheer excessive scale. They do not send a punitive expedition. They launch an armada capable of conquering a continent. From the ports of Brundisium and Ostia, the Roman war machine spills into the Adriatic like a slow-moving landslide of timber and iron. 200 massive warships, the heavy quinqueremes that crushed Carthage, tear through the waves, their bronze rams gleaming wetly in the sun, accompanied by 20,000 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry. It is a force so disproportionate to the threat that it suggests Rome intends not just to defeat the Illyrians, but to erase the very idea of them from the map. Teuta, still flushed with the confidence of her recent victories, is busy besieging the island of Corcyra, modern Corfu, believing that the war will be fought on her terms, in the narrow straits and hidden bays where her Lembus wolf packs reign supreme. She does not yet understand that the lion has learned to swim, and it has brought the entire pride with it. But there is one man who sees the horizon clearly, a man standing on the ramparts of Corcyra, watching the Roman sails stain the southern sky like a gathering storm. This is Demetrius of Pharos, Tuta's most brilliant general and the commander of a garrison on the island. He is a man of sharp angles and sharper ambition, a warrior who calculates odds with the cold precision of a banker. Demetrius looks at the approaching Roman fleet, a forest of masts that stretches as far as the eye can see. And then he looks back at his own defenses, brave men, swift ships, but ultimately gnats against a hurricane. In the dim light of his command tent, surrounded by maps of the coast that he knows better than the lines of his own palm, Demetrius makes a choice that will stain his name forever in the songs of his people. He realizes that loyalty to a widow queen is a coin that is rapidly losing its value, while the favor of Rome is a currency that is about to become the gold standard of the world. The First Illyrian War was decided not by steel, but by treachery. Before a single arrow is loosed, before the first drop of blood can salty the water, Demetrius sends a secret messenger to the Roman consuls. He does not offer a battle. He offers a key. In a move that stuns Teuta and collapses the Illyrian strategy in a single afternoon, Demetrius surrenders Corcyra to the Romans without a fight. The gates are thrown open. The Illyrian garrison stands down in bewildered silence, and the Roman legions march into the strategic heart of the Adriatic, not as conquerors fighting for every inch, but as liberators welcomed by a traitor. It is a betrayal so complete, so surgically precise, that it breaks the spine of the Illyrian resistance before the war has truly begun. The psychological shockwave of this defection travels faster than any ship. As news of Demetrius's treason spreads north, the illusion of Illyrian invincibility shatters like glass. The coastal cities of Apollonia and Dyrrhachium, seeing the fall of the impenetrable Corcyra and the overwhelming size of the Roman army, open their gates in rapid succession, toppling like dominoes in a gale. The wolf packs that were meant to swarm the Romans are left leaderless and confused, scattered by the betrayal of their alpha. Teuta, isolated and enraged, is forced to retreat north, her kingdom shrinking with every passing hour. She flees to the fortified city of Rhizon, located deep within the twisting fjord-like Bay of Kotor, a place so remote and protected by towering limestone cliffs that the sun barely touches the water for half the day. Here, in the gloom of the citadel, she paces the stone floors, listening to the reports of her empire dismantling itself. The winter sets in, a bitter season of grey skies and freezing rain that matches the mood of the besieged queen. The Romans, proving they are not merely brute soldiers but patient strategists, do not storm her fortress. They simply wait, tightening the noose, blockading the coast, until the reality of her position becomes undeniable. By the spring of 228 BC, the pirate queen, who had once laughed at Roman threats, is forced to bow her head. The peace treaty she signs is a document of humiliation, a carefully constructed cage designed to clip the wings of the Illyrian eagle. She is forced to abdicate her claims over the southern lands, pay a crushing annual tribute to Rome, and most painfully, accept a restriction that strikes at the very heart of Illyrian identity. No more than 2 armed Lembus vessels are allowed to sail south of the city of Lissus. It is a castration of their naval power, a legal decree that turns the masters of the sea into prisoners of their own coast. But the cruelest cut of all is not the tribute or the borders. It is the reward given to the architect of her ruin. Rome, in its pragmatic cynicism, does not execute the traitor. It crowns him. Demetrius of Pharos is installed as a client king, given rule over the Dalmatian coast as a reward for his perfidy. He stands on the shore watching the Roman fleet depart, wearing a crown bought with betrayal, a wolf who has been given a golden collar by the shepherds he once hunted. The Romans sail home, believing they have pacified the Adriatic, celebrating a triumph in the streets of the capital, where the mob cheers for the defeat of the pirate queen. They believe the problem is solved, that the Illyrian menace has been tamed by the installation of a puppet. But they have made a grave error in judgment. They have assumed that a man who betrays his own queen will remain loyal to a foreign senate. They have left a wolf in charge of the sheepfold, and as the Roman sails disappear over the horizon, Demetrius is already smiling, his mind turning away from his new masters and toward the vacuum of power they have left behind. The war is over, but the peace is a lie, a thin veneer of calm stretching over a sea that still churns with ambition. The Adriatic is quiet for now, the waves washing over the wreckage of Teoda's dreams. But in the silence, a new threat is germinating, one that will grow in the shadow of Rome's distraction. The traitor king walks back to his palace, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the stone, each step a promise that the next war will not be fought for survival, but for empire. There is a specific kind of silence that descends upon a cage when the predator inside decides that the bars are not made of iron, but of spun sugar, brittle enough to be shattered with a single violent lunge. For a decade, the Adriatic Sea had lain under the heavy blanket of the Roman peace, a Pax Romana that felt less like tranquility and more like a suffocating hold. Demetrius of Pharos, the man who had traded his honor for a crown, sat in his island fortress, watching the world with the restless pacing energy of a wolf, wearing a collar that chafed his throat. He had played the part of the obedient client king perfectly, bowing to the Senate's decrees and policing the waters for his masters. But beneath the veneer of submission, the pirate's heart still beat with a wild, chaotic rhythm. He watched as Rome's gaze drifted away from the sea and turned north toward the Alps, where the Gallic tribes were stirring in a storm of rebellion that demanded every ounce of the Republic's attention. He saw the legions marching away, their backs turned to the coast. And in that distraction, Demetrius saw not a risk, but an invitation. The treaty he had signed, the one that limited his ships and bound his ambition, suddenly looked less like a law and more like a piece of parchment that could be burned. It begins slowly, a testing of the waters, like a prisoner checking the lock on his cell. A few ships slip past the forbidden boundary of Lissus, sailing south into Greek waters under the cover of a moonless night, when no lightning bolt strikes him down, when the Senate remains silent, consumed by the Gallic panic. The trickle becomes a flood. Demetrius tears the treaty into shreds and scatters it into the wind. He builds 90 warships, a fleet that violates every clause of his agreement, and allies himself with the Kingdom of Macedonia, the ancient enemy of Roman influence. The tame wolf has bitten through his leash. He unleashes a reign of terror across the Cyclades, sacking cities and enslaving merchants, turning the Adriatic back into his private hunting ground. He believes, with the arrogance of a man who has never truly been punished, that Rome is too busy to notice the fire he has started in their backyard. But Rome is a beast with many eyes, and while its attention may wander, its memory is long and unforgiving. The year is 219 BC, and the Senate, realizing that their watchdog has turned rabid, dispatches Lucius Aemilius Paulus to put the animal down. Paulus is not a politician. He is a blunt instrument of war, a general who does not believe in negotiation. He arrives in Illyria not to talk, but to dismantle Demetrius's kingdom brick by brick. The campaign that follows is a masterclass in psychological shock. Paulus does not chase the pirate fleet across the open water. Instead, he strikes at the psychological anchor of the rebellion, the fortress city of Demale. Demale was considered impregnable, a stronghold perched on a rock that was said to be beyond the reach of man or god. Demetrius had boasted that it could withstand a siege for years. Paulus takes it in 7 days. The speed of the conquest is so terrifying, so utterly absolute, that the morale of the Illyrian forces disintegrates instantly. The impregnable city falls not to starvation, but to the sheer relentless aggression of the Roman assault, sending a message that echoes across the mountains. There is no safe place. Demetrius, stunned by the loss of his northern anchor, retreats to his home island of Pharos, determined to make his final stand in the place where his power began. Pharos is a natural fortress, a rugged island with a fortified city overlooking a harbor that is treacherous to any captain who does not know its secrets. Demetrius masses his troops here, confident that he can bleed the Romans dry on the beaches. But Paulus is not a man who fights the battle his enemy wants. He arrives at Pharos under the cover of darkness, but he does not land his entire force. Instead, he plays a trick as old as warfare itself, yet executed with a freshness that catches the pirate king completely off guard. He lands a small force of men in a wooded area near the harbor, ordering them to stay silent, to become part of the landscape, invisible ghosts waiting in the ferns. At dawn, he sails the rest of his fleet openly toward the harbor, making a noisy, clumsy show of preparing for a landing. Demetrius, seeing the Roman ships and believing this is the main attack, surges out of the city gates with his army, eager to crush the Romans while they are vulnerable in the surf. He charges down to the water's edge, his men screaming their war cries, their eyes fixed on the ships. It is exactly what Paulus wanted. As the Illyrians engage the ships, the hidden Roman force emerges from the woods behind them. The trap snaps shut. Demetrius turns to see his line of retreat cut off. The ghosts he didn't know existed now, charging into his rear guard with disciplined, silent fury. The battle is over before it truly begins. The Illyrian army, caught between the anvil of the ships and the hammer of the ambush, collapses into panic. Demetrius, the man who thought he could outsmart an empire, finds himself standing in the wreckage of his own hubris. He does not die with his men. That is not his way. Historians still argue whether Demetrius truly believed he could rival Rome, or if he was merely a compulsive gambler who could not resist rolling the dice one last time, knowing that flight was always an option. True to his nature as a survivor, he abandons his army, slipping away in a single ship while his city burns behind him. He flees across the sea, not into obscurity, but into the court of Philip V of Macedon, where he will spend the rest of his life whispering poison into the young king's ear, urging him to war against Rome. Back on Pharos, the smoke clears to reveal a scene of total devastation. The Romans do not just occupy the city, they level it, they tear down the walls, burn the ships, and leave the island a smoking ruin, a monument to the price of betrayal. The Second Illyrian War ends not with a treaty, but with an erasure. Lucius Aemilius Paulus returns to Rome a hero, celebrating a triumph that displays the wealth of the pirate kingdom to the cheering crowds. But the victory is shadowed by a looming darkness. While Rome was busy crushing the pirate king, a far greater threat was marching through the snows of the Alps. Hannibal Barca has crossed into Italy, and the legions that just conquered Illyria are about to be called to face the greatest military genius of the ancient world. Demetrius is gone, a broken exile in a foreign court, but the chaos he helped foment has left the back door of the Republic unguarded, just as the wolf is knocking at the front gate. The Adriatic falls silent once more, but it is a nervous silence, the quiet of a house where the occupants know that something is moving in the dark and the locks have all been broken. The Illyrians are defeated, their fleets smashed to kindling, but the spirit of resistance has not been extinguished. It has merely been driven underground into the deep valleys and high peaks where the Roman eagles cannot fly, waiting for the next fool or the next hero to pick up the sword. Time drifts forward like a cloud passing over the moon, sliding across 60 years of uneasy silence to arrive at the year 168 BC, where the final act of the Illyrian kingdom plays out not as a grand tragedy of heroes, but as a grim farce of greed and deception. The stage is set in the city of Skodra, the modern-day Shkoder, a fortress perched high above the confluence of rivers, looking down on a world that has grown darker and more dangerous. The man sitting on the throne is King Gentius, the last of his line, a ruler whose appetite for wine is matched only by his desperate need for coin. He is not the visionary that Agron was, nor does he possess the steely cunning of Teuta. He is a man cornered by history, ruling a fractured land while the shadow of Rome stretches long across the Balkans. To the south, the Third Macedonian War is raging, a grinding conflict between the legions of the Roman Republic and King Perseus of Macedon. Perseus is desperate. He knows that he cannot defeat the Roman war machine alone, so he looks north to the Illyrians, seeing in Gentius not a brother in arms, but a tool to be bought, used, and discarded. This conflict, which will ultimately decide the fate of the Mediterranean, births one of the strangest diplomatic episodes in ancient history, a tragic comedy sparked by a con artist wearing a crown. Perseus sends his envoys to Skodra with a proposition that glitters in the candlelight: an alliance against Rome in exchange for 300 talents of silver. To Gentius, whose treasury is empty and whose chieftains are restless, this sum is not just wealth, it is salvation. It is enough to hire mercenaries, to rebuild the fleet, to restore the glory of the RDA. But Perseus is a man who counts every coin, and he has no intention of parting with such a fortune if he can get the war for free. He plays a game of psychological manipulation that would be admired by any modern grifter. He allows the Illyrian envoys to see the silver, to touch the stamped ingots, to verify the seal on the bags. He even allows the caravan carrying the treasure to cross the border into Illyrian territory, moving slowly, tantalizingly close to the king's grasp. But he attaches a condition, a test of loyalty that serves as the trap. He demands that Gentius commit an act from which there is no turning back, an act that will irrevocably sever any hope of peace with Rome. Gentius, blinded by the promise of the silver that is just a few miles down the road, takes the bait. He orders the arrest of 2 Roman ambassadors who are present in his court, throwing them into the damp, rat-infested dungeons of Skodra. It is a violation of diplomatic immunity so flagrant that it amounts to a declaration of war, written in bold, suicidal strokes. The moment the cell door slams shut, Gentius has crossed the Rubicon. He sends word to Perseus that the deed is done, that Rome is now their common enemy, and extends his hand for the payment. And this is the moment the trap snaps shut. Upon hearing that Gentius has committed himself to war, Perseus, safe in the knowledge that the Illyrians are now stuck fighting Rome whether they are paid or not, orders the caravan to turn around. He recalls the silver before it ever reaches the king's treasury. Gentius is left standing on the ramparts of Skodra, staring at the empty road, realized he has sold his kingdom for a ghost. He has started a war with the greatest power on earth for a bribe that he will never receive. Historians still argue whether Gentius was simply a naive fool outmaneuvered by a superior intellect, or if his desperation clouded a mind already dulled by years of excess. But the result is the same. He is alone. The Roman response is terrifying in its speed and efficiency. The Senate does not tremble. It simply dispatches the praetor Lucius Anicius Gallus, with a force twice the size of the Illyrian army. Gallus is a man of action who understands that momentum is everything. He does not give Gentius time to rally his tribes or to realize the full extent of his isolation. The Roman legions move like a landslide, crossing the Adriatic and smashing into the Illyrian defenses with a violence that leaves no room for negotiation. The war, if it can even be called that, lasts a mere 30 days. It is less a campaign and more a police action. One by one, the Illyrian cities, seeing the writing on the wall and having no silver to pay their defenders, open their gates to Gallus. The Illyrian fleet, the Lembus ships that once terrorized the seas, are captured in their harbors without hoisting a sail. The climax comes at Scodra itself, the last refuge of the duped king. Gentius watches from the walls as the Roman siege lines encircle his city with the geometric perfection of a constrictor snake. There is no heroic last stand, no charge into the teeth of the enemy. The fight has gone out of him. The realization of his folly sits heavy in his stomach, heavier than the wine he uses to dull the fear. Within days, the gates of the fortress open, and the king of the Illyrians walks out, not with a sword in hand, but with dust on his head, prostrating himself in the dirt before the Roman praetor. It is a pathetic end to a dynasty that once made the Senate tremble. Gallus enters the city, frees the imprisoned ambassadors, who emerge blinking into the sunlight, the living evidence of Gentius's crime, and formally accepts the surrender. The kingdom of the Ardii, the pirate empire that defied Rome for nearly a century, is dissolved with the stroke of a pen. Gentius and his family are clapped in irons and shipped off to Italy, destined to walk as trophies in Gallus's triumph, paraded through the streets of Rome before being exiled to a quiet, ignoble death in the Umbrian town of Iguvium. The treasury is looted, the ships are confiscated, and the royal lineage is extinguished. But for the common people of Illyria, the fall of the king is not the end of the suffering. It is merely the beginning of a different kind of darkness. The Romans are not content with mere military victory. They intend to ensure that this jagged coast never threatens them again. They dismantle the political structure of the land, slicing the unified kingdom into 3 separate autonomous districts, a partition designed to shatter any sense of national identity. It is the classic Roman strategy of divide et impera, divide and rule, applied with surgical ruthlessness. The bustling trade routes fall silent, the shipyards are closed, and a heavy bureaucratic quiet descends over the fjords. The Illyrians, once the wolves of the sea, are about to be broken to the yoke, transformed from warriors into subjects, their destiny no longer written by the tides, but by the ledgers of Roman tax collectors. The sun sets on the independent Illyria, casting the mountains into deep shadow, and as the night air cools the stones of Scodra, the silence is broken only by the marching boots of the occupiers, a rhythmic pounding that sounds like the hammering of nails into a coffin. The age of kings is over. The age of the province has begun. The peace that settled over the Illyrian coast after the fall of King Gentius was not the restorative silence of a healing wound, but the suffocating stillness of a prison cell where the air has grown stale and heavy. The Roman Senate, having decided that the Illyrians were too dangerous to be allowed unity and too profitable to be exterminated, applied their oldest and most effective formula of control: divide et impera, divide and rule. They took the map of the kingdom and tore it into 3 distinct autonomous pieces drawing invisible lines across the mountains and valleys that possessed the stopping power of a fortress wall. It was a stroke of administrative violence that severed the arteries of the nation. A man living in the first district was suddenly a foreigner to his cousin in the second, forbidden by Roman law to trade, to intermarry, or even to travel across the border without a stack of permits that he could neither read nor afford. The bustling market towns, once loud with the chaotic haggling of tribes exchanging salt for wool and iron for wine, fell into a ghostly quiet as the internal economy was strangled. The roads that had connected the highlanders to the coast became overgrown, reclaimed by the brambles, as the flow of people and goods was paralyzed by a blockade made of parchment and ink. Rome had not just defeated an army, they had dismantled a society, atomizing the Illyrian people into isolated pockets of humanity, unable to organize, unable to conspire, and unable to remember who they used to be together. But if the political partition was a cage, the economic reality that followed was the whip. The Romans had noticed the silver jewelry draped around the necks of Tutor and Gentius, and they knew that the jagged mountains of the Balkans hid veins of ore that were the envy of the Mediterranean. With the legions came the publicani, private Roman corporations of tax farmers and contractors who operated with the ruthless efficiency of a syndicate and the legal immunity of the state. These were not government officials concerned with the stability of the province. They were venture capitalists concerned only with the quarterly return on their investment. They leased the mining rights from the Senate for massive sums, and to recoup their costs, they turned the Illyrian population into the fuel for an industrial machine that consumed human lives as casually as a fire consumes dry wood. The warriors who had once stood on the decks of the Lembus, feeling the salt spray and the boundless freedom of the Adriatic, were now driven underground, forced to trade their spears for pickaxes and their horizon for the crushing dark of the silver mines. This was the era of industrial-scale horror, a century of darkness that is often glossed over in the triumphs of the Caesars, but was lived day by agonizing day by the people of the mountains. The mines, located in the remote, unforgiving interiors near Damascene and the Drin Valley, were essentially death camps with a production quota. The conditions were suffocating, a claustrophobic nightmare where men worked naked in the stifling heat of the deep shafts, the air thick with rock dust that coated their lungs and turned their breath into a wheezing rattle. They crawled through tunnels barely wider than their shoulders, chasing the glitter of silver through the limestone, their only light coming from flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the rock, looking like the ghosts of the ancestors they had failed. There were no shifts, only exhaustion. There was no safety, only the constant, terrifying rumble of the earth shifting above their heads, a sound that signaled a collapse that would bury them in a tomb of their own making. The publicani overseers, men with dead eyes and heavy clubs, stood at the tunnel mouths, tallying the weight of the ore and ignoring the weight of the bodies that were dragged out alongside it. It was a system designed to extract every ounce of value from the land and the people, turning the fierce pride of the Illyrians into bullion to fund the gladiator games and marble temples of a city they would never see. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of the Illyrian mines was a deliberate policy of punishment intended to break the spirit of the tribes, or simply the callous byproduct of a Roman economic system that viewed non-citizens as talking tools. But the result was a slow-motion genocide of the soul. The silver flowed south to Rome, minting the coins that paid the legions, while the blood stayed in the north, soaking into the rocky soil. Yet, in this century of humiliation, something unexpected began to happen in the dark. The mines, intended to be the grave of Illyrian strength, became a crucible. The tribesmen, forced together in the bowels of the earth, stripped of their tribal distinctions, and united by a common misery, began to forge a new kind of solidarity. The artificial borders drawn by Rome on the surface meant nothing in the deep tunnels, where everyone bled the same color. A quiet fury began to build, not the flash-in-the-pan anger of a raid, but a deep tectonic pressure like magma rising beneath a dormant volcano. They learned the discipline of the work gang. They learned to communicate with a glance, a nod, a rhythm of hammers tapping against stone. They hardened their bodies in the heat and the labor, transforming from sailors into creatures of the earth, possessing a stamina that was superhuman. The Roman governors, sitting in their villas on the coast, sipping wine and reading reports of record profits, believed the Illyrians were broken, tamed beasts of burden who had forgotten the taste of freedom. They saw the bowed heads and the silent obedience and mistook it for submission. They did not see the eyes that burned in the shadows, watching, waiting, calculating. They did not understand that they were not burying the Illyrian spirit. They were planting it. For 100 years, the pressure mounted, passed down from father to son in whispered stories of Queen Teuta and the days of the wolf packs, a secret heritage kept alive by the very people Rome thought it had erased. The silver that left the mines was bright and cold, but the men who mined it were becoming something else entirely. Harder than the rock they broke, and hotter than the furnaces they fed. The silence of the countryside was not peace. It was the holding of breath before a scream. As the 1st century BC bled into the 1st century AD, the Roman Republic collapsed into an empire, and the world changed again. But in the Illyrian mountains, time stood still, waiting for the spark that would ignite the gas damp of 100 years of oppression. The chains of silver were heavy, but silver is a soft metal, and soft metals can be broken if the hands pulling at them are strong enough. The Publicani counted their coins, oblivious to the fact that they were purchasing their own destruction, financing the incubation of a revolt that would nearly bring the empire to its knees. The gnats had become moles, and the ground beneath Rome's feet was about to give way. It is the year 6 AD, and the Roman Empire stands at the very zenith of its power, a colossus of marble and iron that spans the known world from the sands of Syria to the mists of the Atlantic. Augustus, the first emperor, sits on the Palatine Hill, an old man now, watching the machinery of his creation hum with the smooth, rhythmic precision of a water clock. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is the law of the land, and the Mediterranean has become a Roman lake, quiet and obedient. But peace is a hungry beast that must be fed with constant expansion, and the eyes of the empire have turned north, toward the deep, dark forests of Germania, where the Marcomanni king Maroboduus has built a kingdom that rivals Rome in strength. To crush this rival, the future emperor Tiberius assembles a massive invasion force, a hammer designed to shatter the German tribes once and for all. But a hammer needs a handle, and Tiberius needs men. He sends out the call to the provinces, demanding levies of auxiliary troops to swell the ranks of his legions. The order reaches the mountains of Illyria, the land Rome believes it broke and buried a century ago. The Roman governors, blind in their arrogance, stripped the province of its young men, gathering the Dalmatians and the Pannonians into grand assembly points, handing them swords, shields, and spears, and ordering them to march north to fight and die for a city that has given them nothing but chains. It is a mistake of catastrophic proportions, a strategic blunder that historians still argue whether it was born of simple incompetence or a total misunderstanding of the Illyrian character. Rome has just committed the fatal error of arming the very people who hate them the most, gathering the wolves together, putting steel in their teeth, and then turning their back. The spark ignites in the spring, not with a chaotic riot, but with the terrifying discipline of soldiers who know exactly what they are doing. The Illyrian auxiliary units, mustered and armed, do not march toward Germany. They look at the Roman officers, barking orders at them, men who treat them like cattle. And then they look at each other, and in that silent exchange, the century of humiliation evaporates. They turn their weapons inward. The revolt begins with a speed that defies belief, spreading like a wildfire driven by a gale. The Roman officers are slaughtered where they stand, cut down by the very gladius swords they had issued just hours before. This is not a disorganized tribal uprising. This is a mutiny of veterans. These men have served in the Roman army. They know the formations, they know the trumpet calls, and they know that the legionary is mortal. Leading this storm are two men who seem to be conjured by fate itself, a coincidence of history that lends the revolt a mythic quality. Both are named Bato. There is Bato of the Dicitiates, a Dalmatian chieftain of fierce intelligence and charisma, and Bato of the Bruci, a Pannonian leader of equal stature. The two Batos joined forces, uniting the fractured tribes of the Illyrians into a single terrifying fist. The divide-and-rule strategy that had kept the peace for 100 years collapses in a single afternoon as the artificial borders dissolve and the Illyrian nation is reborn in blood. The Great Illyrian Revolt, known to the Romans as the Bellum Battonianum, explodes across the Balkans, severing the communication lines between Italy and the East and turning the empire's backyard into a slaughterhouse. The rebels do not just defend their homes. They go on the offensive. They sweep down from the mountains, sacking the Roman colonies, burning the villas of the Publicani, and destroying the hoarded silver mines that had been their prisons. They move with the speed of the Lembus ships, but now their ocean is the land, and their waves are armies of infantry that appear out of the mist to crush isolated Roman garrisons. The news reaches Rome not as a report of a border skirmish, but as a shockwave that shakes the foundations of the capital. The mood in the city shifts from imperial confidence to cold, naked terror. Emperor Augustus, a man who has survived civil wars, assassinations, and political purges, is reported to be visibly shaken. He enters the Senate House, his face pale, and delivers a warning that freezes the blood of every senator present. He tells them that unless drastic measures are taken, the enemy could be at the gates of Rome within 10 days. It is a statement that shatters the illusion of invincibility. The gnats are no longer buzzing. They are marching on the throat of the world. The panic in the streets of Rome is palpable. The wealthy flee to their country estates. The grain markets collapse, and the shadow of the sack of Rome by the Gauls centuries ago looms over the collective memory of the people. This is not a rebellion. It is an existential crisis. Rome is forced to halt its invasion of Germany, abandoning the campaign against Maroboduus instantly. Tiberius is forced to turn his massive army around, marching them south in a desperate race to intercept the Bators before they can cross the Alps. But even this is not enough. The scale of the uprising is so massive, involving an estimated 800,000 people and 200,000 warriors, that Rome is stretched to its absolute breaking point. Augustus, in a move of utter desperation, begins to conscript the unthinkable. He forces the wealthy to free their slaves so they can be drafted into the army, a measure that signals the empire is scraping the bottom of the barrel. He recalls veterans from retirement, empties the garrisons of the provinces, and assembles a force of 15 legions, half of the total military strength of the Roman Empire. It is the largest army ever assembled by Rome to fight a single enemy, a testament to the sheer lethality of the Illyrian threat. The war that follows is a grinding, brutal slog, a conflict of attrition where no quarter is asked and none is given. The Illyrians, fighting on their own terrain, use the mountains as a weapon, luring the heavy Roman columns into narrow valleys and ambushing them with boulders and arrows, bleeding the legions dry in 1,000 nameless skirmishes. They are fighting for their existence, fueled by the memory of the mines and the whips, and for 3 long years they hold the might of the world at bay. It is a Mars war, as the Romans would later call it, a conflict so severe that it felt as if the god of war himself had descended to earth to orchestrate the carnage. The Illyrians have achieved what no other people, not the Carthaginians, not the Greeks, not the Gauls, had managed to do in centuries. They have made Rome afraid. The nights in the capital are long and sleepless, the citizens listening for the sound of barbarian drums on the wind, realizing that the empire they thought was eternal is actually fragile, held together only by the fear it inspires. And that fear has just been broken by 2 men named Bato, who have dared to look the eagle in the eye and strike it down. The rebellion is a fire that threatens to consume the house of Augustus, and the only water they have to fight it with is blood. Rivers of it, flowing south from the Danube to the Adriatic, turning the grey limestone of the mountains into altars of sacrifice. The peace of the last century is revealed to be a lie, and the reckoning has arrived with the force of a landslide, unstoppable and deafening. The panic that had gripped Rome slowly hardened into a cold, merciless resolve, embodied by the figure of Tiberius, the future emperor, who now took command of the war not as a soldier, but as an exterminator. He understood that the Illyrians could not be defeated on the battlefield, for they refused to offer one. They were mist and shadow, striking from the tree line and vanishing before the legions could form their shield walls. To fight them with swords was to fight the wind. And so, Tiberius decided to stop fighting the warriors and start fighting the land itself. He unleashed a strategy of scorched earth that was terrifying in its thoroughness, a systematic dismantling of the biological capacity of the Illyrian provinces to sustain human life. The Roman columns moved through the valleys, not to conquer, but to burn. They set fire to the ripening fields of grain, turning the harvest into black ash that coated the throats of the starving population. They slaughtered the herds of goats and sheep, leaving the carcasses to rot in the sun as a warning to the gods. They poisoned the wells and felled the orchards that had taken generations to grow. It was a war of silence, where the only sound was the crackle of burning timber and the weeping of families watching their future disintegrate in the smoke. Tiberius was weaponizing hunger, knowing that a warrior who can dodge a spear cannot dodge the slow, gnawing agony of an empty belly. The mountains, which had been the rebels' greatest ally, became their prison, a barren rock where nothing grew, and where the winter snows buried the weak. Yet, even as the land died around them, the rebellion did not break from the outside. It fractured from within, poisoned by the same tribal divisions that Rome had exploited for a century. The pressure of the starvation strategy revealed the fault lines in the alliance between the two Batos. In 8 AD, Bato of the Breuci, the leader of the Pannonian tribes, looked at his starving people and his burning villages, and his resolve crumbled. Perhaps he thought he could bargain for mercy. Or perhaps he simply lacked the iron will of his Dalmatian counterpart. In a secret meeting on the banks of the river Bathinus, he betrayed the cause, surrendering his forces to the Romans in exchange for his own survival. He handed over Pinnes, the young king of the Pannonians, to the Roman wolves, repeating the cycle of treachery that Demetrius of Pharos had started centuries before. But this time, the betrayal did not go unpunished. Bato of the Decitiates, the fierce heart of the rebellion, heard of the treason and moved with the fury of an avenging spirit. He did not flee. He marched north, surrounded the traitors' camp, and captured Bato of the Breuci. There was no trial, no long speech, just the swift justice of the mountains. The traitor was executed by his own former ally, his body left as a testament that the Illyrian code of honor was worth more than life itself. The rebellion had eaten its own tail, but in doing so, it had purified itself. Now, only the diehards remained, the men who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The war culminated in 9 AD at the siege of Andetrium, the hilltop fortress near modern-day Split, where Bato of the Decitiates made his final stand. It was a place where the earth met the sky, a fortress of natural rock reinforced by desperate hands. Tiberius, sensing the end, arrived personally to oversee the siege, bringing with him the full weight of the Roman engineering corps. They built ramparts, siege towers, and catapults, surrounding the mountain in a ring of steel and timber. Inside, the Illyrians were reduced to eating leather boiled in water, their bodies gaunt, their eyes burning with a feverish light. They rolled massive boulders down the slopes, crushing the Roman testudo formations like beetles, and launched daring night raids that kept the legions in a state of constant terror. But they were fighting against the inevitability of math. Rome had more men, more food, and more time. The end came not with the storming of the walls, but with a quiet realization that the sacrifice had been enough. The fire had burned itself out. Bato, seeing that his people faced total extinction if the siege continued, opened the gates. He did not come out begging. He walked out of the fortress standing tall, a warrior who had held the world hostage for 3 years and surrendered to Tiberius. The meeting between the two commanders is one of the most poignant moments in antiquity, a conversation between a conqueror and a king who has lost everything but his dignity. Tiberius, perhaps respecting the tenacity of his foe, asked Bato simply, "Why did you rebel? Why did you war against us and your own interests for so long?" Bato looked the future emperor in the eye, his voice raspy from the smoke of his burning country, and delivered a line that stripped the veneer of civilization from the Roman conquest. He said, "You Romans are to blame for you send as guardians of your flocks, not dogs or shepherds, but wolves." It was a devastating indictment, a truth spoken in the ashes of defeat that acknowledged the predatory nature of the empire. Tiberius had no answer for the moral weight of the accusation, but he had the victory. Bato was spared the executioner's blade, a rare mercy for a rebel leader, and was sent into exile in Ravenna, where he would live out his days watching the sunset over the Adriatic, a caged lion far from his mountains. The great Illyrian revolt was over. The cost was staggering. The Roman historian Suetonius called it the most difficult war Rome had fought since the Punic Wars against Carthage. The province was decimated, the population thinned by sword and famine, the cities reduced to rubble. The silence that fell over the Balkans was total, a graveyard peace where the survivors moved like ghosts through the ruins of their former lives. But in this devastation, a strange alchemy began to occur. The Romans, having learned the hard way that the Illyrians could not be treated as slaves, changed their approach. They stopped sending wolves. The administration that followed was firm but fair, focused on integration rather than exploitation, and the Illyrians, having expended their fury and proved their valor to the world, began to look at the empire not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a structure to be inhabited. The sword that had failed to cut the throat of Rome would eventually be sheathed in Rome's own scabbard. The warriors who had terrified the legions would, in time, become the legions. The fire of the revolt had burned away the old tribal animosities and the resistance to the outside world, leaving behind a hardened, tempered people who were ready for a new destiny. The shepherds were gone. The wolves had been tamed, and what remained were the guardians of the future. The land lay fallow, recovering from the burns, waiting for the rain that would wash away the ash and reveal the iron that lay beneath. The silence that follows a great fire is usually a time of mourning, a hollow pause where the survivors sift through the ash and try to remember the shape of what was lost. But in the mountains of Illyria, the silence was a cocoon. For 2 centuries following the Great Revolt, the history of the region seems to vanish from the chronicles of the Senate, disappearing into the hum of administrative efficiency. There were no more pirate queens, no more defiant kings, and no more armies gathering in the secret valleys to slit the throats of centurions. To the casual observer in the Roman Forum, it appeared as though the Illyrians had finally been broken, their fierce spirit extinguished by the crushing weight of the legions and the suffocating blanket of the Pax Romana. But this was an illusion born of distance. The spirit of Teuta and Bato had not been destroyed. It had been recruited. Rome, in its cold pragmatism, had realized that the men who had fought them to a standstill for 3 years were too valuable to be wasted in the silver mines. The empire needed steel to hold back the barbarians pressing against the Danube frontier, and it found that the hardest steel was forged not in the workshops of Italy, but in the rocky, poverty-stricken villages of the Balkans. A quiet migration began, not of refugees, but of recruits. Young Illyrian men, looking at the barren soil of their fathers and the scars of the old wars, saw the Roman army not as an instrument of oppression, but as a ladder to the sky. They traded their tribal leathers for the lorica segmentata, the segmented armor of the legionary, and learned to shout orders in Latin. They brought to the legions a terrifying vitality that the soft, city-bred boys of Italy had long since lost. The Italian recruits pampered by the wealth of the empire, viewed military service as a grim duty or a political stepping stone. But for the Illyrian peasant, it was a profession of honor, a return to the warrior heritage of their ancestors, only now sanctioned by the state and paid in silver denarii. As the 2nd century bled into the 3rd, a profound shift occurred in the physiology of the Roman Empire, a transformation so subtle that the aristocrats in the capital failed to notice it until the sword was already at their throats. The center of gravity was shifting away from the Mediterranean, away from the olive groves and the marble porticos, and moving north to the Danube River, the wild, cold frontier where the empire met the darkness. Here, in the sprawling fortress cities of Pannonia and Moesia, a new breed of Roman was being created. These men spoke a rough soldier's Latin, heavily accented with the guttural tones of the Illyrian mountains. They worshipped the old gods of war with a fervor that unnerved the cynical priests of Rome, and they viewed the emperor not as a distant god-king, but as a general who should be covered in the same mud as his men. Historians still argue whether this militarization was a deliberate strategy by Rome to channel Illyrian aggression, or simply a desperate reaction to a shortage of manpower. But the result was the creation of a state within a state. The Roman army became an Illyrian army. The Danubian legions became the most feared and respected units in the world, the iron spine that held the collapsing body of the empire together. While the Senate bickered over taxes and the urban mobs rioted over bread, the Illyrian soldiers stood on the frozen banks of the river, staring into the fog of Germania, holding the line. They were the watchdogs that Bato had spoken of. But they were no longer biting the hand that fed them. They were biting the enemies of the hand, defending a civilization that still looked down on them as semi-barbarians. Then came the storm. The crisis of the 3rd century arrived like a thunderclap, a 50-year nightmare where the world seemed to unmake itself. The empire was torn apart by civil wars, plague, economic collapse, and simultaneous invasions from every direction. The Goths poured over the Danube, the Persians smashed through the east, and the Franks raided deep into Gaul. The central authority in Rome disintegrated. Emperors were crowned in the morning and murdered by sunset. Between the years 235 and 284 AD, there were no fewer than 26 claimants to the throne, most of whom died violently. The civilized Roman aristocrats proved utterly incapable of handling the catastrophe. They were men of rhetoric and robes, ill-suited for a world that demanded iron and blood. The empire was fragmenting, splitting into 3 separate pieces, ready to be swallowed by the Dark Ages 1,000 years too soon. It was in this moment of absolute chaos, when the lights of civilization were flickering out one by one, that the Illyrians stepped out of the barracks and into the throne room. They looked at the soft, panicked leadership of Rome and decided that if the empire was to be saved, they would have to do it themselves. The barracks emperors were born. These were not men born in purple silk. They were men born on straw mats in the Balkan hinterlands. They were soldiers who had risen through the ranks by sheer merit, men who had scars on their bodies and calluses on their hands. They did not care for the etiquette of the Senate or the traditions of the Forum. They cared about survival. The transition was violent and necessary. It began with figures like Maximinus Thrax, a shepherd-turned-soldier of immense physical strength, who was the first emperor to never set foot in Rome, ruling entirely from his military camp. He was a brute a hammer used to smash the immediate threats, but he signaled the end of the Italian monopoly on power. The Illyrian soldiers realized that the power to make an emperor lay in their swords, not in the approval of the Senate. They began to elevate their own generals, men who understood the reality of the frontier. The irony was staggering. The very people whom Rome had spent centuries trying to conquer, the people they had enslaved in mines and branded as pirates, were now the only ones with the strength to hold the Roman world together. The wolf had indeed entered the sheepfold, but he had not come to eat the sheep. He had come to kill the other wolves. This was the vengeance of the Illyrians, not to destroy Rome, but to become Rome, to inhabit its skin and wield its power with a competence that the Romans themselves had lost. As the crisis deepened and the Goths grew bolder, the empire waited for a savior, someone who could stitch the bleeding wounds of the state back together. And he would come, not from the patrician families of the Seven Hills, but from a humble peasant family in Sirmium, a man who would earn the title Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. The candle flickers in the drafty barracks of the Danube, illuminating the rough, determined faces of men sharpening their swords, waiting for the dawn of a new age where the masters of the world would speak with the accent of the conquered. In the year 270 AD, the Roman world was not a map, but a mosaic of shattered glass, a collection of broken pieces that cut the hands of anyone foolish enough to try and hold them together. The empire had effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. To the west, the Gallic Empire had seceded, taking Britain, Gaul, and Spain with it. To the east, the Palmyrene Empire, under Queen Zenobia, controlled Egypt and the grain supply, strangling the capital. And in the center, a frightened, hollowed-out Rome waited for the end. Into this terminal chaos stepped a man who seemed carved from the same grey limestone as the Dinaric Alps, a soldier whose face was a map of the frontier and whose will was a hammer of iron. Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, known to history simply as Aurelian, was the quintessential product of the Illyrian barracks. Born to a peasant family near Sirmium, in the heart of the Balkans, he had known nothing but the army since he was a boy. He did not possess the refined education of a senator, nor did he care for the delicate subtleties of rhetoric. He spoke the language of the sword, a dialect of force that was the only thing the 3rd century respected. When the legions elevated him to the purple, he did not go to Rome to be crowned. He went to war. What followed was a 5-year whirlwind of violence that defies logistical explanation, a military miracle that historians still argue whether it was the result of supreme tactical genius or simply the sheer, unstoppable momentum of a man who refused to accept the death of the world. Aurelian moved his armies with a speed that terrified his enemies, marching from the Danube to the Nile and from the Euphrates to the Rhine, stitching the severed limbs of the empire back onto the body with sutures of steel. First, he turned his eyes to the invaders, the Juthungi and the Vandals, barbarian tribes who had grown fat on Roman weakness, were crushed in a series of brutal engagements in northern Italy. Aurelian did not just defeat them. He chased them, hunted them, and broke them, sending a message that the wolf was back at the door. But he knew that victories in the field were fleeting if the heart was vulnerable. And so, with a pragmatism that was entirely Illyrian, he ordered the construction of a massive new defensive wall around Rome itself. The Aurelian walls, which still stand today as a scar of brick and concrete wrapped around the city, were a tacit admission that the Pax Romana was dead. The capital was no longer safe behind the shield of the legions. It needed stone to survive. With the heart secured, he turned east to face the desert queen. Zenobia of Palmyra had built a glittering empire in the sand, defying Rome with an elegance that charmed half the world. Aurelian was not charmed. He marched his Illyrian veterans across the scorching deserts of Syria, enduring heat and thirst that would have killed lesser men and smashed the heavy Palmyrene cavalry at the battles of Imoi and Emesa. He captured the queen, bringing her back to Rome, not in a cage, but bound in golden chains, a living trophy of the restored order. Without pausing for breath, he turned west, marching across the continent to the fields of Chalons, where he defeated the breakaway Gallic Empire, forcing the pretender Tetricus to surrender. In just 5 years, the peasant boy from Sirmium had done the impossible. He had reunited the Roman world. The Senate, in a rare moment of genuine awe, granted him the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. It was the highest accolade ever given, and it belonged to an Illyrian. But the tragedy of the Illyrian emperors was that they were often safer on the battlefield than they were in their own tents. Aurelian, the man who could not be defeated by armies, was undone by a lie. In 275 AD, while preparing to invade Persia, a corrupt secretary, fearful of punishment for a minor offense, forged a document listing the names of officers Aurelian intended to execute. The officers, believing the lie and knowing the emperor's ruthless reputation, struck first. Aurelian was assassinated by his own men, a hand of iron brought down by a quill of ink. The empire held its breath, fearing a return to the chaos, but the Illyrian system was stronger than one man. Out of the shadows of the barracks stepped another giant, a man named Diocles, who would rename himself Diocletian. Also born to a low-status family in Dalmatia, possibly the son of a freed slave, Diocletian was the cool, calculating intellect to Aurelian's fiery sword. He understood that the empire was too vast for one man to rule, that the burden of the crown was too heavy for a single neck. He did not try to hoard power. He divided it. In a stroke of administrative genius, he created the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He split the empire into east and west, appointing a senior emperor, Augustus, and a junior emperor, Caesar, for each half. It was a system of checks and balances designed to ensure stability, enforced by the loyalty of the Illyrian legions. Diocletian reorganized the provinces, reformed the currency, and bureaucratized the army, transforming the loose, chaotic empire of the early Caesars into a rigid, fortified machine. He turned the emperor from a first citizen into a distant, semi-divine figure, draped in pearls and gold, separated from the common people by layers of court ritual, a style of kingship borrowed from the East, but enforced with Illyrian discipline. Under his rule, the frontiers stabilized, the economy crawled out of the abyss, and the Roman world was given a new lease on life. But perhaps the most telling glimpse into the soul of this Illyrian savior came at the end of his reign. In 305 AD, Diocletian did something that no Roman emperor had ever done before. He voluntarily retired. He abdicated the throne, stepping away from the supreme power of the world, and returned to his homeland. He built a massive palace on the coast of Dalmatia, near the village of Aspalatos, modern Split, a fortress villa that was half luxury retreat, half-military camp. There, the man who had saved civilization spent his final years growing cabbages in his garden. When his former colleagues begged him to return to power to settle a dispute, he famously replied, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggest that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." It was the ultimate Illyrian victory: to conquer the world, fix it, and then walk away to listen to the waves of the Adriatic, finding more value in the soil of his birth than in the purple of the throne. The crisis was over. The Illyrians had caught the falling sky and placed it back on its pillars. The empire was safe, or so it seemed, but the final transformation was yet to come. The center of the world had shifted, and the next Illyrian to wear the crown would not just restore the empire, he would fundamentally reinvent it, moving the very soul of Rome to a new city on the banks of the Bosphorus, leaving the Tiber behind in the twilight of history. If the story of the Illyrians began with a murder in a palace on the coast, it reaches its apogee in a nursery in the city of Nisus, modern-day Niš in Serbia, where the crying of a newborn boy signaled the final and most complete victory of the conquered over the conquerors. The year was roughly 272 AD, and the boy was Flavius Valerius Constantinus, known to eternity as Constantine the Great. He was not a creature of the Roman salon, perfumed and soft. He was pure Balkan stock, the son of Constantius Chlorus, a rough-hewn Illyrian general, and Helena, a woman of humble, perhaps even tavern-keeping, origins. Constantine grew up not in the shadow of the Colosseum, but in the shadow of the sword, raised in the mobile military courts of the Tetrarchy, where the smell of horse sweat and campfires was more familiar than incense. He was a product of the barracks emperor's system, a man who understood that authority was not inherited but seized. When the intricate political machinery of Diocletian's tetrarchy collapsed into civil war, as all systems built by men eventually do, Constantine did not try to put the pieces back together. He smashed them to clear the board. He fought his way across the empire, a tiger unleashed, culminating in the legendary Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. There, under the banner of a new god, he crushed his rival Maxentius and marched into Rome as the undisputed master of the West. But as he rode through the streets of the Eternal City, accepting the cheers of the mob and the nervous adulation of the Senate, Constantine felt a cold distance in his heart. Rome, the physical city of brick and marble, felt old to him. It was a place of decaying pagan rituals, treacherous aristocratic families, and memories of a glory that had long since faded. It was too far from the frontiers where the real wars were fought, too steeped in its own mythology to embrace the future. Constantine, with the unsentimental clarity of his Illyrian ancestors, decided that if the empire was to survive, it could not stay in Italy. The wolf looked at the shepherd's house and decided it was time to move. In a decision that would redirect the flow of history for the next 1,000 years, he turned his back on the Tiber and looked east to the strategic bottleneck where Europe kisses Asia, the ancient city of Byzantium. It was a location that appealed to the Illyrian sense of geography. Defensible, controlling the trade routes of the Black Sea, and crucially, much closer to the Balkan recruiting grounds that were the heartbeat of the army. In 330 AD, After 6 years of frantic construction that stripped the pagan temples of the empire to adorn the new Christian capital, Constantine dedicated the city as Nova Roma, New Rome. But the world would call it Constantinople. The shift was absolute. The center of gravity had moved from the old aristocracy of the Latin West to the vibrant, military-dominated culture of the Greek East, a culture steered by Illyrian hands. The Senate was replicated, but the power was gone. The real decisions were now made in the great palace overlooking the Bosphorus, by men who wore trousers instead of togas and spoke Greek with a soldier's cadence. Historians still argue whether Constantine intended to abandon the West to its fate, or if he simply recognized that the East was the only part of the empire worth saving. But the effect was the same. The city of Rome, once the mistress of the world, began its long, slow slide into irrelevance, becoming a provincial backwater where cattle eventually grazed in the Forum, while Constantinople rose as the golden queen of cities. The Illyrian takeover of the Roman soul did not end with Constantine. It had one final magnificent act to play, embodied by a man who represents the absolute zenith of late antiquity, Justinian the Great. Born strictly as Petrus Sabatius in the dusty village of Tauresium, near modern Skopje in North Macedonia, Justinian was an Illyrian peasant in the truest sense. His uncle, Justin, was a swineherd who had walked to Constantinople with nothing but a loaf of bread in his sack, joined the palace guard, and risen to become emperor through sheer grit and luck. When Justinian ascended the throne in 527 AD, he brought with him the relentless, tireless work ethic of the mountain farmer. He was known as the emperor who never sleeps, a man possessed by a vision of a unified Christian Roman Empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. He was the last of the native Latin speakers to sit on the Byzantine throne, a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval one. It was this Illyrian peasant who gave the world its legal foundation. He ordered the compilation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian, which gathered 1,000 years of messy Roman legal tradition into a coherent system. This code would become the bedrock of all civil law in Europe, the ancestor of the legal systems used today from France to Latin America. The laws that govern modern property, contracts, and family life are, in a very real sense, the legacy of a boy from Skopje who wanted to bring order to chaos. But Justinian's ambition was not limited to paper. He wanted to rebuild the physical world in the image of God, and his masterpiece was the Hagia Sophia. Standing beneath the massive dome of the Church of Holy Wisdom, which floats above the floor as if suspended by a golden chain from heaven, one is looking at the ultimate expression of the Illyrian triumph. The resources of the entire Mediterranean were funneled into this building, a structure so complex and daring that it defied the physics of its time. When Justinian entered the finished cathedral in 537 AD, he is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It was the exclamation of a man whose ancestors had been written off as pirates and miners, now standing at the center of the universe, having built a monument that would outlast the legions, the senators, and the gods of old Rome. Under Justinian, the empire struck back one last time. His general Belisarius, another man of likely Thracian or Illyrian stock, retaking North Africa, Italy, and Rome itself from the barbarians. But these were the final flickerings of the candle. The effort exhausted the state, and a terrible plague, the first pandemic, swept through the world, hollowing out the population. Yet, the transformation was complete. The Roman Empire had been subverted, digested, and reborn. It was no longer the empire of Augustus. It was the Byzantine Empire, a Greek-speaking Christian superpower rooted in the East. The Illyrians had not just survived the Roman conquest. They had hijacked the vehicle of their conquerors and driven it to a new destination. As the sun sets over the Golden Horn, painting the domes of Constantinople in shades of fire and violet, we see the final irony. The people Rome tried to exterminate became the architects of its immortality. The name Illyria would eventually fade from the maps, washed away by the tides of Slavic migration that were already gathering on the Danube. But the spirit of the Lembus and the Publicani mines had ascended to the throne of God's vice-regent on earth. The pirate Queen Tuta could never have imagined that her descendants would not just defeat Rome, but would become the Rome that mattered, preserving the light of civilization in a fortress of their own making, while the West sank into the dark. The map of the world is a thing of ink and parchment, easily rewritten by the victors of history. But the map of the blood is written in stone and silence, and it is far harder to erase. By the 7th century AD, the great imperial machine that the Illyrian emperors had built began to shudder under the weight of new waves of migration. The Slavic tribes, moving in vast numbers from the north and east, flowed into the Balkans like a slow, inexorable tide, filling the valleys and the plains that the Romans had once cleared. The cities that had stood as monuments to Latin order, Salona, Skodra, Naissus, were slowly submerged in this new cultural flood, their names changing, their temples repurposed, their languages shifting. The name Illyria, which had terrified the Senate and defined an era of naval supremacy, began to fade from the lexicon of the world, replaced by new duchies and kingdoms. To the chroniclers in Constantinople and Rome, it appeared as if the Illyrian race had finally been extinguished, dissolved into the great melting pot of history, their distinct identity washed away by the Slavic deluge. But this was a misunderstanding of the Illyrian nature. They were a people of the high ground, of the jagged peaks and the hidden defiles, where the air is thin and the soil is hard. When the lowlands changed hands, the descendants of Teuta and Bato did what they had always done. They retreated up into the accursed mountains, the Proclitiae, where the terrain itself was a fortress that no army could storm. There, in the clouds, the Illyrian world did not end. It merely went to sleep, preserving itself in the amber of isolation. They shed the armor of the Roman legionary and picked up the shepherd's crook once more, returning to the primal, clan-based existence that had sustained them before the first Roman galley ever crossed the Adriatic. It is here, in the silence of the high valleys, that the final mystery of the Illyrians plays out. A survival story so tenacious, it defies the laws of historical probability. Historians still argue whether the modern Albanian people are the direct, unbroken linguistic descendants of the ancient Illyrians, or if the lineage is more complex, woven from the remnants of Paleo-Balkan tribes. But for those who listen to the music of the language, the echoes are undeniable. The language spoken in these mountains is an orphan in the Indo-European family, sitting on a branch of its own, older than Latin, older than the Slavic tongues, a living fossil that has survived the grinding wheel of empires. It carries within it the sounds of the ancient coast, the words for sea and stone, for honor and blood, that would have been familiar to King Agron. But the survival is not just linguistic, it is spiritual. The fierce code of honor, known as the Kanun, which governed life in the northern mountains for centuries, reads like a memory of the RDI Confederacy. It is a system based on Besa, the word of honor, a sacred promise that is worth more than life itself. It reflects a world where the state is distant and untrusted, where a man's safety depends on his clan, and where justice is a private matter settled by blood. It is the same spirit that led Tuta to defy a diplomat, the same spirit that drove Batu to burn his own country rather than submit. Rome conquered the land, but it never truly conquered the code. The wolves of the Adriatic were never domesticated. They simply waited out the storm. As the centuries rolled on, empires rose and fell like waves on the shore. The Byzantines faded. The Ottoman Turks arrived with their horsetail standards and their minarets. And still, the people of the mountains remained. They were conquered on maps, taxed in ledgers, and converted in name. But in the privacy of their stone kullas, fortified tower houses that look remarkably like the watchtowers of the Illyrian coast, they remained masters of their own destiny. They became the Great Wall of Europe, the warriors who, under leaders like Skanderbeg in the 15th century, held the line against the Ottoman expansion, buying Western Europe the time it needed to blossom into the Renaissance. In a profound historical irony, the barbarians, who had once threatened the Pax Romana, became the shield of Western civilization, the Athleta Christi, or champions of Christ, protecting the very culture that had once tried to enslave them. The descendants of the pirates became the guardians of the gate. The silver mines that had been their graves were forgotten, reclaimed by the forests. But the iron will that had been forged in those mines endured, tempered by 2,000 years of resistance. And now, as we stand at the end of our journey, looking back across the sweep of time, the landscape of the Balkans seems to glow with a different light. We see the ruins of the Roman amphitheaters, the broken columns of the Greek temples, and the overgrown roads of the legions. And we realize that these are just the shells of history, the discarded skins of empires that have died. But the living history is in the faces of the people who still walk these paths, in the shepherds moving their flocks through the limestone passes, in the fishermen casting their nets into the turquoise waters of the Adriatic. The Illyrians are not gone. They are waiting in the stone, in the wind that howls through the fjords, and in the blood of a people who remember, perhaps without even knowing why, that they were once the kings of the sea. The story of the Illyrians is not a tragedy of extinction. It is a triumph of endurance. They taught the world that an empire can conquer a territory, but it cannot conquer a geography, and it cannot kill a memory that is hidden in the heart of a mountain. The noise of the battles has faded, the shouts of the centurions are dust, and the screams of the rebellious cities have been swallowed by the silence of the ages. What remains is the land, rugged and beautiful, and the quiet, persistent heartbeat of a people who refuse to vanish. The ghost of Queen Tuta still walks the ramparts of Rhizon, not in anger, but in peace, watching the moon rise over the water, knowing that while Rome fell, her children are still here. The gnats survived the lion. The night has won. The fire has burned down to embers now, casting a soft, pulsing low against the walls of our shared history. The legions have marched away into the mist, their armor silent, their wars finished. The ships are docked in the harbor of dreams, the water lapping gently against their wooden hulls, rocking them to sleep. It is time to let the dust settle. You have walked across centuries tonight, through the palaces of kings and the dark of the mines, standing on the walls of besieged cities and sitting in the throne rooms of emperors. But now, the heavy gates of history are closing, locking away the noise and the fury for another night. The stone is cool, the air is still, and the only sound left is your own breathing, slow and steady. You are safe here, in the quiet aftermath, watched over by the ghosts of guardians who have finally found their rest. Let the weight of the story slide off your shoulders. Let the names and dates dissolve into the darkness, leaving only the feeling of endurance, of strength that survives the night. The world is vast and old, and it will be there when you wake. But for now, the moon is your only king, and the silence is your only kingdom. Sleep now. Drift away on the tide. Sweet dreams.